In the last few years, MicroStrategy has outperformed pretty much everything else. Does it still make sense to buy MicroStrategy stock? Is it better than buying plain old Bitcoin? Let's have a look at some data most people are not considering. Now here is simply the MicroStrategy stock price. And the vertical line indicates when MicroStrategy started buying Bitcoin. Since that moment, the stock went up by more than 2,600%. Now, since MicroStrategy is taking on that much risk with Bitcoin, how much would the price potentially go down if Bitcoin was to turn around? Now, have a look at this long-term Bitcoin chart. This starts when Bitcoin was just a few cents all the way to today. And again, the vertical line is when Michael Saylor started buying Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin price itself did not appreciate that much. It went up by 700% since Michael Saylor got involved. And so there's always a discussion, right? What kind of risk on asset is the best? Does it make sense to simply buy a NASDAQ 100 ETF? Does it make sense to buy Bitcoin? Does it make sense to buy MicroStrategy? We're going to look at relative valuation charts in this video. Now this is Bitcoin relative to the NASDAQ 100. Again, the vertical line is when Michael Saylor started buying. And so Bitcoin did better than the NASDAQ 100 by more than 300% since August of 2020. What I find also fascinating is that a lot of the outperformance happened, of course, in the early days. But when we just look at the last 7 years, it's not that clear if all of the volatility that we get with Bitcoin gets properly compensated. At the end of 2017, Bitcoin was at 20K. Now it's around 100K. And yes, that's a 5x. But the NASDAQ 100 also went up. And so the outperformance versus just buying plain old QQQ is quote unquote only 62% over the course of 7 years. So that's an annual alpha of 7%. Is this justified with the potential downsides that we see every now and then of 70%? It probably depends on your holding duration, right? If you buy now and you forget for the next 10 years, it's probably fine. If you buy now and you hold only for 2 or 3 years, it might not be that great. Again, risk adjusted, right? Volatility versus long-term returns. But yeah, Michael Saylor started buying at a very nice point in time. And because of that, MicroStrategy did very, very well. And it was able to outperform most other tech stocks. This is MicroStrategy relative to the NASDAQ 100 since the purchases of Bitcoin. It outperformed by 1,172%. But let's have a look at one data point, because Bitcoin already crashed once during the holding period of MicroStrategy, and maybe it will crash again, right? Nobody knows. Let's compare the data point where MicroStrategy started buying Bitcoin to the low at the end of 2023. Bitcoin still outperformed the NASDAQ by 30%, but MicroStrategy actually did not outperform the NASDAQ during the same period of time. Isn't that interesting? It appears as if MicroStrategy stock is more risky than Bitcoin. If you're not 100% bullish on Bitcoin in the near future and you think maybe buying MicroStrategy stock can diversify myself away from this, maybe I can reduce risk from this, it's probably not the case. Again, here is Bitcoin relative to the NASDAQ from top to bottom. It underperformed by 71% roughly in the very worst case. For MicroStrategy, in the very worst case, it's a minus 86, maybe 87%. So when things are bearish, they're even worse for MicroStrategy. Now here's the thing, right? Its own software business, it's also got the Bitcoin holdings, and it's got a lot of financial engineering around the Bitcoin holdings with those convertible bonds. It's always interesting to look at the valuation of MicroStrategy stock relative to the Bitcoin holdings, relative to the net asset value. And here's that net asset value premium over time. At the beginning of 2024, the Bitcoin holdings of MicroStrategy were pretty much equal to the value of the company. Then we saw how this detached quite a bit. Suddenly MicroStrategy stock cost 2.5 times the Bitcoin holdings. Then this picked up even higher to 3.4 times. And now it has normalized to a degree, but still it's roughly 2x. So for every Bitcoin that MicroStrategy holds, you are paying the equivalent of 2 Bitcoin by buying MSTR. Now let's go with the pessimistic approach again. Let's say there is 0 value in the financial engineering. Let's say the software business is also rather dying. Let's say the fair valuation would be just a 1x. So whatever MicroStrategy is currently holding in Bitcoin, that should be the value of the company, right? Let's just work with that. In that case, the price should now go down relative to Bitcoin by roughly 50%, right? We're now at a 2x, we're going to go down to 1x minus 50%. Here's MicroStrategy relative to Bitcoin, so we would see a correction that looks like this. That's not necessarily volatility out of the ordinary, right? We've seen that before. It's actually quite interesting how much the MicroStrategy stock tends to diverge from the Bitcoin price every now and then. From May of 2022 to November of 2024, MicroStrategy stock outperformed Bitcoin by almost 770%. Still, even when we go back to a 1x in net asset value, since MicroStrategy bought Bitcoin, it outperformed Bitcoin by roughly 70%. So does this mean that MicroStrategy is simply the long-term better investment? Well, since the price of MicroStrategy stock dropped more during the bear market compared to Bitcoin, then it's also expected that when Bitcoin appreciates over the long term, that MicroStrategy stock should appreciate more. In other words, MicroStrategy stock could be seen as a levered instrument on Bitcoin. But let's crunch the numbers further. If MicroStrategy stock is a levered version of Bitcoin, then the charts of the MSTR price relative to Bitcoin and the Bitcoin price itself shouldn't look that different, right? Let's say MicroStrategy stock is a 2x Bitcoin levered instrument. Then when MicroStrategy stock goes up by 20%, then Bitcoin is expected to go up by 10%. So when we look at MicroStrategy stock divided by the Bitcoin price, that chart should look similar to just the Bitcoin price itself as well. Let's see if that is actually the case. So at the top, we see MSTR relative to Bitcoin, and at the bottom, we see the Bitcoin price itself. How much do those two charts resemble? They resemble to a degree, but it's clearly not perfect. So for example, the top in MSTR relative to Bitcoin happened in February of 2021. The top of Bitcoin though happened in November of 2021. The bottom in Bitcoin happened in November of 2022. And at that point, MicroStrategy already outperformed Bitcoin by 85%. So there might be some kind of a connection, but it's definitely not perfect. We can also look at this mathematically. There is this measure of the correlation coefficient, and that's this over here. The correlation coefficient goes between -1 and +1, and whenever it's at +1, it means that two assets move in the same direction at the same time. This is a 1-year correlation coefficient. In other words, it measures how much do two assets move in the same direction during a span of a year. And this is increasing over time quite a bit. In other words, in the early days, people traded MicroStrategy still as its own instrument, but especially since Q2 of 2024, the two instruments move very much in sync, at least on a 1-year time frame. And so that's then interesting, right? Because when we reduce the time frame to say only 3 months, then we see there is less correlation. In other words, when there's a 3-month period where the two assets did not necessarily move in the same direction, where they were pretty much decoupled, that might be a potential point in time to shift. So let's say at the end of August of 2024, MicroStrategy did poorly and Bitcoin did well. Then maybe it makes sense to sell some Bitcoin in favor of MicroStrategy. Currently, we don't see that. So in the last 3 months, the two assets move very much in sync. But let's see, maybe the correlation coefficient goes down again, and then we can buy the thing that underperformed and sell the thing that outperformed. Of course, this game is a bit risky because overall the net asset value is still at 2x. And nobody knows if that premium will stay. Now, here's the thing. There are plenty of topics within crypto that aren't very sexy, but that are, I believe, very vital to make money long term. For example, concepts like correlation. What we see over here are correlation coefficients. Did you know, for example, that most altcoins tend to be more correlated with Ethereum than with Bitcoin? In other words, it's not when Bitcoin goes up that the altcoins go up as well. It's rather when Ethereum goes up, then the altcoins go up as well. Or did you know that the correlation coefficient of the S&P 500 to Ethereum and thus the altcoin market is actually quite volatile? In other words, it does make sense to also own stocks, not just Ethereum, not just crypto. The common narrative is that when traditional markets go down, that crypto tends to go down as well, right? That crypto is simply just a levered bet on, say, technology stocks. That's not the case. The correlation coefficient is relatively close to 0. Or do you know the long-term expected expected returns of various asset classes, of say gold, of say the S&P 500, of Bitcoin, of altcoins. When we don't just own crypto, but we also own property, for example, and we've got that portfolio, what kind of returns do we need in order to beat monetary debasement, but also in order to at some point to get financially free? How much money do we need to have enough passive income to not having to work anymore? What are expected long-term returns, and how much should we actually allocate towards crypto and towards property, towards stocks, gold, bond, etc.? What actually makes sense? When there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars on the line, not having this properly nailed down is a huge problem. And when the market isn't that great anymore and the upside for Bitcoin could be somewhat limited, how can we still make money? How can we make money from charts like this? What we see over here is Balancer relative to Ethereum. We can make money by shorting this. Balancer has very bad tokenomics, the supply increases over time, and so it tends to do worse than Bitcoin and Ethereum over the long term. And we can make money from that, again, from the relative valuations, not just from US dollar valuations. When we look at how quickly is the monetary base expanding, and we put this into relationship to how quickly are salaries increasing, we actually see that pretty much everybody is falling behind over time. And this is not just true for the poor people, this is even true for the top 5% of earners. By the way, if you earn $500,000 per year, then you are in the top 5%. But yeah, data like this is useful. And those are not necessarily the sexy topics that work well on YouTube, right? On YouTube, it's the 100x altcoin gems that get all the clicks. But when you talk about diversification and correlation, etc., people just fall asleep. But it's the long-term planning, the long-term proper allocation towards different asset classes that actually make the difference. And so have a look at all of this. Those are tutorial videos of the premium membership of this channel. It's down below, thebitcoinstrader.com. There's more than 100 tutorial videos in total. What are my favorite crypto macro indicators? How do interest rates impact different asset classes? We've just seen how the market got spooked because the Federal Reserve might get more hawkish. Or how do we adjust our returns for risk mathematically, right? Everybody can get more returns by increasing the risk massively, but the idea is we want to get the best returns for the risk. And so there are ways to calculate this using alpha and beta. Those are all very complex topics, but I strongly believe that it's the skilled people, the people that have most knowledge, that tend to make most money over time. Now, besides all of those tutorial videos, there are also various chats in premium where I try to be active as well. So in case you've got any questions, just tag me in a message in those premium chats and I try to reply. The membership is currently $165 per month. This is not for people that only have a net worth of $1,000, right? This is for people that actually have to manage wealth in the tens of thousands, preferably even hundreds of thousands of dollars. There is a 1-week money back guarantee as well. So in case you don't like premium, just message me within the first week and I refund you 100%. There's really zero risk for you. Now, if it's your first time here, feel free to subscribe. I publish videos regularly. A like would be very much appreciated as well. It helps the channel grow. See you in the next video or see you in premium. Cheers.